And now, please join me in welcoming Richard Sennett and Alice Wilson.
Well, for those of you who haven't seen us before, I'm Alice and this is Richard. And I should begin by saying how thrilled I am to be here tonight. I have read Richard's books and followed his lectures and essays for many, many years. So it's wonderful for me to have this chance to talk to him this evening. And first, a few words about how we're going to organise it. We're here, as you know, to discuss Richard's latest book together. And he is going to speak about the key themes in the book. We will then have a conversation about it, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask questions to Richard before we break, and he will kindly do the book signing. So over to Richard, who's going to discuss the key themes in the book.
I want to tell you a little about this book, and in a way, I hope that the book is not what people expect. Sort of your first impression of a book about cooperation might be how to get everybody on the same page, to work together as a team, like, rowing together in a scull. About cooperation as kind of coordination of everybody contributing their might to get something done. That's not what I mean by cooperation. I was interested in a different kind of problem, which is how do you cooperate with people who are different from you? People you don't know, you don't like, maybe, that you disagree with, which is a much more adult kind of problem of cooperation. We live in a very complicated society with lots of difference in it. And how do people reach across those bonds of difference to be able to work with people unlike themselves? And that's the problem I set myself. Curiously, if you work in an artisan's workshop, that's often the problem that people who are actually working together face. Not, of course, they have to work together in the sense of coordination and being sometimes on the same page. But the more skilled people get, the more, as it were, their page is their own page, if I can put it that way. And that in really complex workshops, like a scientific laboratory, which is a workshop, this same problem of how you deal with difference, different skills, different understandings of a problem emerges. So what I am trying to do is look at what are the skills that people need to communicate across these barriers of difference. And I'll just mention 4 of them to you. The first has got a very fancy name, which is called dialogics. And what a dialogic skill means, this fancy name, is really a synonym for what we think about as good listening skills. What it means is that you are able to understand and respond to what somebody means to say to you rather than what they do say to you. It's quite different from dialectics, where I say something and you go, no, I disagree entirely. And then we have a back and forth, and then we come to an agreement about something, or we think we have gotten closer to each other. What dialogics is about is a term invented by Mikhail Bakhtin, who is a Russian linguist, about 60 years ago, is that you say something and I say, that's not really what you mean, but rather than debate it with you, I'm going to find ways to find out what you really do mean. So I become skilled in asking you questions, in listening to your silences, in the things that are too difficult for you to say, and so on. And the result of that is that I understand you better, and perhaps you feel like you're better understood, but we don't necessarily come to an agreement. So in that way, it's also unlike dialectical things, which interchanges, which lead to this kind of cooperation, where everybody is on the same page. In dialogics, there is no end like that. And as we know in intimate life, in our family life, and love affairs, most of our relations with people we really care about are dialogical rather than dialectical. Remember, we give them the space to be themselves. We understand over time what they mean to say when they seem angry, but they're not really angry, and so on. And I've tried to understand that same principle in larger social relations. So dialogics is a form of cooperation, cooperating with the intention of another person. The second of these, and it's difficult to learn, the second of these skills is in this kind of cooperation, is the use of the subjunctive rather than the declarative. And this follows on from the first. If I say to you, I think X, your response is, okay, I agree, or no, I disagree. But if I say, I would have thought that perhaps, if I use that subjunctive voice, the ambiguity that establishes leaves room for you to come back and discuss with me. And you Brits are masters of I would have thought that. Sometimes you don't mean it. You say, I would have thought that, and then there's a real punch. British academics are famous for that. But in everyday life, the notion of using the subjunctive is a way of inviting somebody's response. And that means that you are comfortable with dealing with ambiguities rather than clarities. And I think for this kind of complicated cooperation, dealing with people who are different, that learning how to be comfortable with and to work with ambiguity through the deployment of the subjunctive voice is a very important thing, skill to master. I've seen this in the States in conflicts, you can read about this in the book, between Koreans and blacks, African Americans, which are enormously fraught. These are two groups that really have been in each other's throats for decades, and frequently violently so. And the ways in which they become more adept at making peace with each other have to do with gradually, instead of being very declarative and in your face, being rather more evasive and more subjunctive in what they say to each other. And there's a long section in my book about that. The third of these skills is that complex cooperation is more often informal than formal. And I'm not going to tell you a lot about that because it's a long, complicated subject, but just intuitively, when you have something like Robert's Rules of Order to run a meeting, everybody gets their say, but very few times do people actually engage with each other. You have an order of a meeting, and everybody is heard, but it's something that often is a very unproductive way to deal with complex issues. And what my research team and I did was look at the ways to informalize settings where there's a lot of conflict, so that people feel that there aren't really any guidelines or rules, that they have to deal with each other in order to give a shape to meetings. And I put this as a kind of rule, and this is what diplomats know this as well, that when you're in a situation of people relatively calm with each other on the same page, the formality serves the purpose as a kind of record keeping, and that helps you come to cooperate in that kind of we're all pulling together way. But when you're in a situation of difficulty, the fact that you have this informalized situation means that you have to deal with the other in order to keep the meeting going. And so it's an important issue in this more contested thing. Finally, I've made an argument about this kind of complex cooperation, which seems to enrage religious people. And I don't know why this is. I'm an atheist, but I'm a really nice atheist. But it seems to get them really going. And this argument is this, that what the address to the other in this kind of complex cooperation invokes empathy rather than sympathy. It's a really important distinction. When we feel sympathy for somebody else, it's like, there but for the grace of God go I. Adam Smith in the Theory of Moral Sentiments says, I see somebody else trip in the street and I think, oh, I hurt. You have this, that's me. Whereas empathy is, I wonder what he tripped over. It's a cooler emotion. It's a cooler address to the other. You're interested in what's happening to them rather than feeling that identifying with them. Sympathy is a matter of identification. Empathy is a matter that keeps distance and replaces identification by curiosity. In the workshop, empathy is a really important phenomenon. You've got to sort of be curious, why did that experiment go wrong? Instead of going, oh, poor you, or something like that, you want to know, what did you do wrong? What happened? In social relations, it's got a different configuration. Imagine that I am, as I am, an upper middle class white man, and somebody who is a black, poor exile starts telling me the story of, say, being tortured or being brutalized in some way. If I express sympathy for them by saying, oh God, that must have been terrible, I can imagine it was awful, the other person could get quite angry about that. How could I imagine that? How could I presume to identify with somebody else who is in a more difficult position than I am? Whereas if I said to them, tell me about it, what happened to you? What was it like? Which is an empathic reaction, I'm showing respect. I'm not presuming that I can know what somebody else experiences. And I think this is probably, this address to the other through empathy rather than sympathy is really the way in which we honor somebody else's differences. And I've tried in my book to show what this means in everyday relations with people in a variety of settings, in the workplace, community life, and so on. So, I'm sorry, I'm very long-winded. All professors are long-winded. But this is a kind of the basic pattern of this book. I just tell you one consequence of thinking about cooperation, complex cooperation, in this way that emphasizes dialogics, the subjunctive voice, informality, and empathy, is that a problem in urban life, which we have not addressed very well so far, I think can be addressed, and that is the relation between communities at their edges. We've tended to think when we have different communities together that their relations, their discussions with each other, how they cooperate, is a matter of solidarity, what they have in common. But my idea is that we shouldn't try, say, between a middle-class white community and a poor black or poor Asian community, try to find how they can make common cause, but how they can speak to each other even across the barriers of being different, without having to presume that there's something that knits them all together. So I just say as a final word about this, that my book is an argument for cooperation and against solidarity. That's the point of my book. And that's what's got these religious people in a twist, evidently. This is very bad ethically. At least the Catholic Archbishop of London thinks this is a terrible council, cooperation rather than solidarity. He described it as wicked, which I took as a compliment for a while. Now I don't do that so much anymore. So that's where I'm at.
Well, so unless you're empathic, as we should all learn to be with that Archbishop, I'm sure you've...
Bishop,
not Archbishop. We have all made mental notes that we should become more dialogical, more empathic, use the subjunctive more often, and be more sensitive to informality. Now, for those of you, and I imagine that's many of you in the audience who've read this book, you'll know that like all Richard's books, it has an absolutely incredible array of references. This is always one of the delights of reading a Richard Sennett book. So this traces complex cooperation from the medieval guilds, who were, of course, key themes in The Craftsman, as well your previous book, through the writings of Michel de Montaigne, the christening of one of the sons of Victoria and David Beckham, the restoration of the Neues Museum in Berlin, the workings of the John Lewis Partnership, and so on and so on. So the inevitable question is, given that this is the second book in your trilogy, which deals with the skills we need to sustain daily life, why choose cooperation, and why specifically write about it now? Why is it suddenly so important?
Oh God, this is a very difficult question.
It's a fair one.
Well, I think why we're writing about it now is that is in part a political economy answer, which is that the ways we're working in modern forms of work are more and more ersatz forms of cooperation. Every MBA student in the United States, I'm sure you're much more sophisticated here, learns about how to show that you're cooperative in the workplace. It's one of the most fungible skills you're supposed to have. But it's not cooperation in which the cooperation actually deals with things like the other person is difficult, the project you have is impossible, you fail, the other person is in need of real help. And I saw this, I've been writing for a long time I have two arrows in my quiver. One is as I write about cities, and the other is I write about labor. And I saw this in the 90s, how this teamwork in business was a kind of theater of cooperation, in which people really were stabbing each other they were smiling in front, but they were stabbing each other in the back. And it's very pronounced in supposedly new capitalist kinds of labor and high service work and so on. So I think what we've lost in the changes in capitalism that have occurred in the last 30 years or so is the notion that cooperation is meaningful. And that's where I began on the labor side of this. I think there's a political reason for this as well, that most of 20th century left-wing politics, and I'll enroll you all in the left for this evening, has been about solidarity rather than cooperation. I'm appalled when I'm a junkie of politics, so I actually read these manifestos. And I'm appalled at every single labor manifesto I've read since labor came to power in 1997. It's all about people pulling together, about finding the common threads of multiculturalism. You can spin this out any way you want. It's about annihilating the differences that hurt between people and keeping differences kind of garnish.
So can you explain how that
And I think
notion of
that's
solidarity
wrong.
is different from cooperation?
It's different because what it does, that sort of well-meaning labor version of it, we don't know about conservatives. We're sure they probably, well, let's not go there. But what it does is annihilate the fact, say I'm a second-generation Muslim, and you're a second-generation, you're a 20th-generation Brit. There are things that I've suffered that you never have. And conversely, you've got a sense of place which I will never have in my lifetime. These are painful differences. Why should we say that those painful differences are not the subject of our relations with each other? Why should we have this pablum, this Tony Blair pablum, that everybody can find a common thread of life in Britain? It's infantilizing, And a lot of the language of left-wing politics, of solidarity, because it denies, the fact that people differ in painful ways and complex ways, it produces a kind of political language which is inferior to what we know from private life about how difficult it is to be with somebody else. It makes the public realm into something that's everything is nice or soluble. That's another thing that I find extraordinary about this. The language of solving a problem is the language of solidarity, right? But we know that most problems in life are not soluble. You just live with the ambiguity, things that are half measures. You live with the fact that you cannot resolve in this dialectical way your relations with other people. So that's I guess that's the real world. You know, I'd like to see. I mean, another way to put this is I'd like to put the social back into socialism. And the social means recognizing how difficult social relations are between people.
Well, I suspect there will be few people who would argue with your analysis of recent Labour Party manifestos and the language that's used. But surely there is a way of looking at the recent development of Britain in suggesting that there has been genuine progress in recognising the differences that you're talking about and seeing them as points of distinction or interest. And we have, broadly speaking, become a less racist, a less homophobic, a less bigoted society in recent years. So how does this sit with your argument? Had somebody told me 20 years ago that gay marriage would be legalised in my lifetime, I would have laughed and said, if only, but it won't be. Right. Just as Americans of my generation never thought their country could have a black president and have been delighted to be proved wrong. Right. Do you feel that this doesn't represent real progress, or that it's not enough progress?
Fair enough. That's a fair enough question. It is progress, or at least it's the diminution of a source of conflict. Maybe, you know, I'm biased about this because I've been dealing with two areas of where you have a lot of inequality and a lot of conflict, which is work and urban life, you know. But I take your point. It's all not black and it's all not darkness out there. But let me ask you in turn, why do you think that this happened in Britain? It's not so much in the States. I think this is, the Obama phenomenon is complicated. But I'm curious why I think this has happened in Britain, because it is striking that you have a gay marriage. People are much more tolerant of that.
Well, it's it's a fascinating subject, slightly off agenda.
Well, what do you think?
I mean, first of all, there's been a very sophisticated evolution of the gay rights movement in Britain, with a knowledge of its history, the sort of horrible history of prejudice, homophobia, and brutality of past years. So I think that gathered momentum, as it did after Stonewall in the United States. And also, I suppose, I would be more interested in your view on this as a non-Brit living in Britain. If you look at popular culture in Britain, so many of the most popular totems are either very gay or very camp. I mean, Coronation Street would be our premier soap for decades. Yeah. Freddie Mercury, who as a teenager in the 70s, I didn't realise was gay. I mean, how was that? I so didn't. I don't think I even registered that he was Asian. So pathetic, I know. The fact that Elton John, who in many ways, I think he entirely unwittingly has pandered to a sort of homophobia, given that his life has been very unhappy in many ways and he had to struggle for his sexuality. Right. I think that made people who didn't feel comfortable about male gay sexuality somehow, had he been dazzlingly beautiful and charismatic and gorgeous and his life been unproblematic, I think they'd have found him more threatening and harder to take. But by the time he married David Furnish, he was a national treasure. Right. He'd sung at Diana's funeral. I think she, although I'm a Republican with a small r, also probably had a very positive influence. Lots of gay friends, a very early AIDS campaigner. I think all these things came together, and suddenly the British didn't feel as uncomfortable with different sexualities as they had for decades.
I see. Well, I don't know, my sense... No, we're having a discussion.
But let's
my sense of this, since you asked me about this, as a foreigner in Britain, although I've lived here 20 years, is that you British are much more tolerant than you think. And I've always had that feeling. And you've done something which Americans don't know how to do, which is not talk about things when they're... I saw this, I came here for a conference in the late 70s, I'm very old, and it was a conference on race relations, and you'd had a race riot here. And the most remarkable thing to me about this conference was that when things hotted up, people, they stopped talking. You know, they avoided the subject. It was brilliant. I mean, it was because they kept talking. But I would say in general that you're a much more tolerant people, certainly, than Americans are, who, if they have a difference with somebody, want to confront them with it. And I mean, part of Obama's problem is that I would say his manner is not the manner of confrontation, you know? And that's enraging to people. They think that he's got some hidden agenda, you know? Particularly to whites, it's enraging. If he were an angry black man, they'd get him. They could put him in a box.
Exactly.
You know? But he's not an angry black man. He's somebody, he's rather British, I think. Yeah, you know, this is, you know. And...
well, it's also an interesting consideration, surely, that had he not been black, to such a sophisticated, cerebral figure may not have been electable. I mean, America clearly got a different package than it had thought. But let's return to cooperation, because we could carry on talking about all of this all evening. There's a very funny passage in your book when you talk about coming to Britain, and we're all talking in the subjunctive, and you haven't got a clue what we really mean. Are there some nations that tend to be better attuned to cooperation than others?
In that way? Yes, well, I mean, I wouldn't put it nationally, but it's a form of, put it another way, it's whether social relations take the form of kind of everyday diplomacy or of a kind of everyday theater, you know? I mean, diplomats, you remember this chapter on everyday diplomacy in my book. I mean, diplomatic ways of dealing with other people, which I think you are, despite yourselves, masters of. It's a way of assuming that the point of a social relationship is to keep the social relationship going. And up to the point where you can't take it anymore. If you're in a country like the United States or France, that's not the point. The point is to display this dramaturgical display of yourself. And one of the things we noticed about when we did this study of cooperation in the workplace is that the French were great at dramatizing. In French working, these are French people working for international corporations, were great at dramatizing how cooperative they were, but were very withdrawn from other workers in the workplace. So I would say I'm not so, some French were wonderful, of course, but I mean, I think it's a question of whether you're in a culture in which the display, dramaturgical display of yourself is foregrounded versus a culture like yours in which diplomacy becomes more of a kind of model for social relationships. And what I'd say to you about this, I mean, I know this has its amusing sides to it, but it's deadly serious because in cultures like France, when you have ethnic conflict between people, for instance, in the faubourg, in the suburbs, and people in the center, the responses of people in the center are not empathetic. They're either, you're victims of, racial injustice, racism, so on, i.e. sympathy on the left. But more largely, they're confronted with other people who are telling them what it means to be laïque, secular, and what it means to be French. And this is one of the great violent, conflicts in France. And the way in which French people talk as secular French people to these people, mostly Muslim in the faubourg, inflames the problems even more. So, I mean, there are many things about Britain which are terrible, of course. But I think you're really quite gifted socially because of this.
And one of the big phenomena of coming years is clearly going to be the increasing power of China, which is going to start influencing many, many more areas of our lives and in very different ways. And in the book, you talk about a phenomenon called the I will mispronounce it, Guanxi network. Could you explain what it is and why you found it so intriguing?
Well, I don't think it will directly have an impact on us, but it's a wonderful form of cooperation, Guanxi. And what it is a form of, say I'm 16 years old and I need the money to go to university. And you're my uncle, I'm in Shanghai, and you're my uncle in Singapore, my Chinese uncle, or once removed, twice removed, who knows. And you pay my school bills. I've incurred a debt to you, but the Chinese don't monetize that debt. That is, I might pay that debt back by giving some medical advice if I become a doctor to your aged mother, or taking in a relative. The whole idea about Guanxi is what's called asymmetrical reciprocity. And you can understand this is a big word for something that's very important. Rather than me saying, I gift you X, so you owe me X, it's me saying, I'll help you, but sometime, somewhere, you or your relatives will help me back. And it's a principle of cooperation which allowed the Chinese, during the worst periods of Mao, to survive internally and also externally. And it's now beginning, lots of debates about whether the Guanxi is changing. But you understand what this is. We think about cooperation as something where I've given you X and you give me Y, and you give me the same thing back. When you have asymmetric reciprocity, you have a social bond which is intense, and it honors both sides. I know I owe you, or my children owe you, but the form in which I give back is what I can give back rather than this contractual form of exchange. And I think it's made them very strong.
And in the book, you draw many other examples of complex cooperation in many different contexts. One of my favourites was Robert Owen and the Rochdale Principles, and you also point out that, wonderful though the Rochdale Principles may have been in many ways, Robert Owen was responsible for the corporate bonus and inventing the original one. So could you explain the purpose of the Rochdale Principles and how they evolved?
Well, you know, both in Britain and to a lesser extent in America in the 19th century, there were very strong cooperative movements. Do you know, by the way, that 2012 is the year of the cooperation, of the cooperative, UN year of the cooperative? That's our fault. And we had lots of discussions about Robert Owen and this. Owen's notion was basically this, that oppressed people need to develop ways of cooperating with each other rather than spending their time in what he called useless anger. And it was the Owenites, it was their great reproach to Marxism. This is all 19th century context. But the notion was that a cooperative was something where poor people pooled their resources, as you know, to not expend useless anger, but to do something for themselves. And these Rochdale Principles, there are 6 of them, I think 6, yeah, 6. There are ways to organize a community savings bank, an old age scheme. You know, they enabled you to establish cooperatives. One of the 6 principles is the bonus. That is, just as in Goldman Sachs, that you distribute the excess that you don't need to run a cooperative every year. But I think he had a rather different idea of the bonus than Goldman Sachs. But, you know, if you think about what's happened for the last 5 years, you know, we've taken we've expended a lot of useless anger against bankers who are much more potent than any of us are at defending themselves. I mean, they own this government, you know? And what we haven't done is going back to cooperative movements to take care of ourselves. And Owen would say to people, forget about them. You're never going to make David Cameron into one nation Tory, no matter how he talks, or maybe even at Miliband. You should be starting new institutions where people pool information about jobs or pool taking care of the sick and so on. So that's what the year of the cooperative was supposed to tell you about. But obviously we haven't done a good job about it. But it's only 12 days have expired since 2004.
If we look at a contemporary example of cooperation in the book, one of the most intriguing ones was the restoration of the Neues Museum in Berlin by David Chipperfield. Could you tell us about that?
Well, this is a wonderful urbanistic example of this. Chipperfield, it was a British architect, as you know, Sir David Chipperfield, was charged with restoring a museum that had been blasted in the Second World War in Berlin. And then in communist period had not been reconstructed. And he had 2 groups fighting each other. One were people who wanted to restore the museum to its 19th century imperialist glory, because it's full of things that the Germans, long before the Nazis came to power, took from the rest of the world. And so those were people, on the one hand, for restoration. And on the other side were people who wanted to clear the whole thing out and make a new museum, a truly Neues museum. Have Chipperfield build something from scratch. And what he did was a kind of repair which incorporated, and I think this is really, to me, very moving about it, which left, for instance, a lot of the bullet holes in the fabric of the museum. He put it back in working order. But when you walk through this museum, you are aware that this museum was bombed by Bomber Harris and then was left to rot by the communists. There are lots of parts of it which are unresolved. And it's a physical experience of something that's dialogical and which arouses empathy rather than sympathy, because you're asking, what are these bits of shrapnel that are left in the fabric? You know, it's a physical translation of this. As he was very diplomatic in negotiating between these two groups, but what interested me was the actual physical form of the museum. It embodies a kind of complex negotiation between two very different pasts. Aha.
Someone who didn't cooperate
Nice,
with their friend.
or maybe did. So whose is it? And it's in B flat, which is very odd for a digital film. So I was interested in both the process by which the museum was made, but also the fact that, you know, what I've described to you is a process, but it also is manifested in physical form. There are dialogical forms of building, you know? And it's a whole issue about, and of course, I have this very philosophical heart. So I was thinking about this as a metaphor about repair and how do we cooperate in how metaphorically repair, there are strategies of repair that are cooperative with the past and that are in denial about the past.
It is an absolutely extraordinary building. Let's talk about an example of failed cooperation and in a completely different sphere, and one that you use in together and allude to fairly often is Google Wave.
Oh yes, that's it's really interesting, and I'm so glad you asked me about this. That interested you.
So why did it fail? And
okay, this is really an interesting project. I was contacted in 2009 when I started working on this book on cooperation by people at Google who said, would you be involved in the beta testing of a new online cooperation program? We think that, you can imagine what they think, that with the web is a wonderful way beyond things like Skype and so on, that we can actually use the web for really serious cooperation. And they invented something called Google Wave. And I and a group of people became amongst its beta testers. That's where you try out the program in a real world situation. And I really learned a lot by the failure of this program. Here's what the engineers had thought, that somebody else, it must be your dinner time or something like that. They had thought that the process of cooperating is coming closer and closer to being on the same page, that dialectical process. And that translated by on screen that the parts of the screen that got bigger were about the parts that people agreed with. And over to the side of the screen were what were called irrelevancies. Now, you know that when you're having a conversation about a complex thing, that something that seems irrelevant, that comes out of left field, that's lateral knowledge, can sometimes be the most important thing that happens in the conversation. And what was happening with Google Wave was that this kind of lateral knowledge was being literally pushed aside, and the people who would raise this lateral knowledge their contributions were being shoved aside. We were having a discussion about ethnic problems in London, and more focusing on problems of religion and so on. But there were some members of this group, and we were spread all over Europe and North America. Some members of this group were saying, well, maybe these problems aren't really as important as the gender problems between generations within Islam, and maybe we should forget about whites in this discussion. They got pushed to the side, and because on the screen their contribution got pushed to the side, these people began to participate less and less, you know? Now, and the project came out with banalities. What everybody could agree on, was junk, whereas all the complexity had been moved to the side. Now, I was interested in this because in a workshop, and particularly in a laboratory workshop, it's often what we think of as lateral knowledge or a lateral procedure, which gets shoved up against something that's difficult, you're trying to make work. And suddenly this thing that looked irrelevant turns the key on the lock to solving a problem that you can't solve within its own terms. It's a very common thing in good laboratory. It's also true in art. You know, you work away at something as a painter. You go away from it, you start looking at something else, or you take a different set of colors, or whatever. And suddenly this other thing begins to unlock the key of what you were trying to do, another practice. And this is a very familiar craft thing that we have this kind of knowledge. But here in the social realm, it was being literally displaced on screen, and we were losing participants and so on. And what was remaining, the common thread, to use Tony Blair's language, the common thread was threadbare, if you'll permit me to say so. It's just dull. So I'm not anti-computer at all, but I was interested in the way in which too purposeful, too organized, too engineered a form of cooperation actually leads to poor results. And again, it's that ambiguous thing. When we leave something indeterminate and informal, oftentimes something from left field comes in as a solution to a problem. Now here, you as Brits have a big issue because you're in a culture of targets, in education and health service and so on. There's not much room for ambiguity. Your masters are trying to close down the area of solutions so that everything is foreseen in advance. And the kind of wild solution in education, the suddenly figuring out that if you could study painting in school, which you no longer can, for credit, I guess it is, that might have something to do with the way you solve a problem in the laboratory. All of that is being dismissed, and you're getting this kind of shopkeeper mentality of knowing in advance what you're trying to find out. That is a recipe for disaster. There's got to be a room for the ambiguous, for intuition. I mean, there has to be in science, and there must be in education as well. And it's only that ambiguity, I'd say, that allows people to really seriously cooperate with each other and share different kinds of knowledge.
So given that you've been thinking and writing
Yeah.
about the subject of complex cooperation for so long, are there any instances of daily life that you just think are screaming out for a more ingenious cooperative approach?
Well, schools. I mean, whenever I look at a schoolroom full of computer screens at which kids are sitting individually, I think, throw them out. Get rid of those screens. Have you ever tried, if you don't own a Mac 27-inch iMac, for 4 people to watch one screen together and discuss what's on it?
It is difficult. But then the content of those screens, this was another issue I wanted to come to. Actually, people may be at their screen in isolation, but the world it opens up to them is completely networked. So, and one thing I wasn't sure where you stood in the book was on social networks like Facebook and Twitter. You were quite ambiguous about them. Do you see them as potentially positive media of communication or largely negative? Do they simply give the illusion of community, in other words?
Well, as you know, I think the Arab Spring tells us that these programs can be used for wonderful forms of cooperation, but they're not the forms for which they were designed. And Facebook, in particular, was a kind of beauty parade. It was meant to be a dating resource amongst undergraduates at Harvard University, as you know. And what's engineered into it is the notion of display rather than interaction. If you remember, I had the example of somebody who had 627 friends, 600, something like that. If each of those friends sent if you multiplied 627 by 627, just for one day, sent one message, what kind of social network would that be? It'd be impossible. You'd have about 8,000 messages. One day. So it's organized, it's a social network organized for display. And I think the holy grail in this is how you get around the problem of display and get communication instead. It's the same problem no.
So do you see Twitter as being more genuinely communicative, obviously at never more than 140 characters?
Yeah, it is, oddly enough.
Because the visual component is lesser.
Yeah, well, there is none.
TwitPic. There are all sorts of ways around it.
Right.
But
it could be. But the point I'd make to you about this is that we're just at the beginning with these devices. And the first time we're out of the box with them, we think about them as social, but they're not really sociable in the sense of interactive. And maybe it will be that smaller intranets of 50, 60 people become the more social, really truly social forms of media. But the logic, of course, of Twitter is to have the billion people that use it so you can send a billion people advertising. And this is why in my first book I was so taken with Linux. I'm a technological, not idiot, but close to it. But I've learned how to program in Linux, and it's a different world, because a world that isn't controlled by Bill Gates.
Well, but that is the sort of dazzling wonder of the internet, isn't
Right.
it? Because Tim Berners-Lee designed it so that everybody has equal access. You and I and Bill Gates
Right.
have the same level of access to it. It can never, however hard Google tries, be monopolized by a single force, because everybody still has entry, which is quite remarkable.
Yes, but it means that you've got to become a craftsman of the internet to use it well. To find sites and places where you can really interact with other people requires not performing a Google search, right? Which will send you up, as you know,
Well,
Google's preferred sites first, and so on. Should we give people time?
I think we should. So, as you've alluded to your last book, The Craftsman, while mics are being prepared and so on, one final question. Your next book is on the making of cities.
Right.
Could you tell us something very quickly about that, and then we'll have questions from the audience?
I could. I'm in the forest at this moment. I mean, it's a book about the craft of urban design, and it's more, in a way, more specialized book. It's about how can we apply the principles of craftsmanship to making cities. But what I've become confused in it, because I'm also looking at how we can become better, more skilled at using cities, more competent urbanites, which is not necessarily a question of design. So I'm deep in this forest now, but that's what it's about. It's about the craft of living and designing cities and the ambiguity between the two of them.
Well, we look forward. So could you, if you have a question for Richard, could you raise your hand, and you will have to speak into the microphone. Okay, one there.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Richard. It's been really interesting, lots of questions to thought. Can I ask a two-part question? Right.
Sure.
The first part is, what do you think about, do we have a cultural inclination to cooperate with people like ourselves? So I was thinking, for example, the idea about social networks, that actually most of us use it to find communities of people that reflect our own thinking.
Yeah.
The second question, I was really interested by your definition around the British mentality, the desire to tolerate, be more tolerant. Is there a difference between being tolerant, between tolerating and cooperating?
Well, let me go, because I really want to address the first of what you're saying. There are forms of toleration which are bred by indifference. You know, you just tolerate that they go their way and you go yours. And it's a question of what form toleration takes. And sometimes toleration by indifference can be very liberating to oppressed groups, you know? People just don't care about you. But your first question is a really interesting one. There's a lot of research done about the quote-unquote natural instinct to cooperate with your own kind. And what's interesting about it, ethologists have done this, and they've done it for both primates and for human beings, is that it seems like it's more natural than cooperating with people who differ from you. But in fact, it's kind of illusion. They found, for instance, that a baby's cooperation with its caregiver, in the past mostly its mother, is as far as we can tell, is a learning during its first year about working well with an object, the nipple, whether it's biological or a real nipple, which is not you. There's no identification in the first year and a half with the people that the newborn cooperates with. So, you know, cooperation at birth and in the most fundamental of its natural cycle is about dealing with that difference in order to survive and so on. Another bit of research, I don't know very much about that, but I do know more about the research that deals with the inevitable relation between cooperation with your own kind and competition with them. The cooperation and competition are not opposites. You know, we have to cooperate, say, on the rules of a game in order to play about it. But it seems that there are forms of cooperation with people who are nearly like you or the same as you that give rise to a kind of Oedipal drama of aggression. And so there's something called the cooperation-aggression complex. You can read about it in my book. And what that is that people who are exactly like you are people whom you never give the freedom to be any different from you. In other words, you're in a kind of competitive relationship about them. Who is the most white? Who is the most Islamic? And the fact that you're all alike to begin with sets up this aggressive, competitive relationship. And Freud is our great guide to this. This is what sibling rivalry, this is the dynamics of sibling rivalry. So that's natural. Whereas the kind of cooperation I'm talking about is more archaic in the life cycle. But it doesn't give rise to that competition for who's the most of a particular identity.
Professor Sennett, thank you for bringing sort of wonderfully nuanced view to this world and this concept of cooperation. We've talked a little bit about the language of left-wing politics and the Labour Manifesto. We're in the middle of, if you like, an experiment in cooperation in government between two groups of people who quite clearly don't like each other but have to get on. Would you care to give a kind of half-term assessment or diagnosis of coalition from the point of view?
Can I be a foreigner? The only question I'd ask you about this is, do you feel, where this really bears in my own life, is the sellout on tuition fees. Would you have stayed if you were Lib Dem in that coalition would you have stayed in the Lib Dem party if your leaders had sold out on this principle? I think at that point I wouldn't have. And the reason for that is that what you have there is cooperation, which is really collusion. You have an agreement so that an elite can maintain itself in power. And that's collusive. You know, those leaders should have been fighting the corner of no tuition fees. That's why they were put in. Isn't that a basic tenet of Lib Dem ideology? That nobody should have to pay to go to university? So when the leaders sell you out, they're collusive, but why cooperate by staying in their party? I don't know, that's my only thought about it.
We have a final question here.
Continuing along the political line, I'd like to bring you back to the point you made about solidarity that I first said.
Yeah.
Is there not a danger that you underplay the importance of solidarity in terms of its relationship to cooperation? And I was thinking when you were talking about the recovered enterprises movement in Argentina after the crash of currency in 2001, 2002. And that really solidarity goes hand in hand with that kind of cooperation that we saw in the process of recovering enterprises and bringing them back to life.
Right.
So it's about the relationship between the two.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. Yeah, maybe I've given too much of an emphasis to it in its North American and European form. I guess I see what you mean. And it's true in warfare as well. You know, people are attacked. They've got to cope together. They've got to be solidarity in order to defend themselves. I guess my vision on this is influenced or warped by the fact that since I am so focused on the labor process and on community conflicts, that it seemed to me that in those contexts, in the community context, it means that too much is left out, and in the work process, it's fake solidarities, you know. And maybe that's the domain in which this argument operates. Maybe it can't be made as a general argument. This is a discussion we'll have over whiskey.
Well, there is a wonderful offer. Richard has very gamely offered to take individual questions afterwards at the book signing, when he will, of course, sign your books as well. I would like to give a huge thank you to him for so sportingly speaking to us this evening.